In this video, we're going to show you how to install the starter on your INFINITI G37X located on the driver's side lower portion of the engine. Underneath the hood, you're going to locate the battery cover on the passenger side. You're going to press up on this little tab here and then one on the other side and remove this cover. Using a 10mm wrench, we're going to go ahead and loosen the nut on the ground terminal. We should be able to spin this terminal and slide it off and set it aside. Underneath the hood, we want to go ahead and remove the driver's side air intake box. We're going to start with our electrical connector right here. You got to push it on this little tab and remove that harness. Now if you follow this over, there's a little clip right here. Just going to pinch the little tabs and pull that harness off like that. Up here we have the hose clamp. We're going to use a flathead screwdriver to go ahead and loosen this. You can also use an 8mm socket to loosen this. We just want to loosen it. We do not want to unwind the entire band. If you follow this over to the right side, you're going to find a 10mm bolt. Zip that out. Set that aside. At this point, we're going to go ahead and lift up on our air intake box. We're also going to be pulling this out of the intake tube as we do so. There are two plastic pins underneath this air box that go into rubber grommets in the frame. You're going to be separating that. Pull that up and out and set it aside. Now we're using a 14mm deep socket, a swivel, and a long extension. We're snaking this down between some of the AC lines to the top bolt or the nut on the top of our motor mount on the driver's side. Let's go ahead and loosen and remove that nut. Using our magnet to go ahead and grab that nut and pull that out. Using a 21mm socket, loosen and remove your lug nuts. Now on our particular vehicle, we have a locking lug nut. We have the key to remove it. If you just have a standard lug nut, go ahead and take it off. Once you have those removed, remove the wheel and set it aside. On the bottom side here, we have this cross member that runs around and it bolts to the exhaust tabs and that comes over and bolts to the bottom side of the transmission. We're going to use a 14mm socket to go ahead, loosen and remove these two nuts, as well as these two bolts. Before you disconnect the steering shaft down at the steering rack, we're going to go ahead and anchor the steering wheel so it is straight. We're going to use our securing strap here. We're going to hook this around the brake pedal arm. We're going to pull this up and through. And we're going to secure it on itself. You can use whatever type of strap you have to go ahead and lock this in place to keep that nice and straight. With the driver's side front wheel removed, we're going to access our steering shaft right here going into the top of our steering rack. This is a 12mm bolt right here we need to loosen and remove. The reason why is we need to separate the steering shaft from the steering rack, pull this up and out of the way so we can gain access to the starter behind it. We use a 12mm socket, shallow socket and extension with our ratchet here. And we did spray this down with some rust penetrant. Now the steering wheel is in its locked position up top. We do want to go ahead and remove this bolt completely. I'm going to spin this back in. Our bolt is getting a little bit tight, so we're going to spray this down with some rust penetrant and then we'll continue to work this till we can get it out. Go ahead and remove that bolt and set it aside. I'm going to spray this down with some solvent. I'm going to wipe this down. So we want to go ahead and pop this U-joint from our steering shaft off of the shaft on the rack itself. So you can use a brass punch or small chisel to go ahead and just tap this up, get it loose. We're using a fat chisel tip here to go between the collar here to open it up. This should open up the gap on the clamp on the splines for the steering rack and allow us to go ahead and get the shaft off. We use our impact gun to try and drive up the steering shaft here. Before we remove this completely, we're going to spray this down with some solvent. The reason why we're doing this is we want to mark this with the shaft and the general placement of where it's going. There when we install this here, we have that general placement for the splines. Now we're going to gain access to our starter right through here, and our starter is bolted right here, and on the front side of it, on the starter solenoid, you're going to see a wire harness come down to a rubber boot. Underneath that rubber boot is going to be a 12mm nut. You're going to peel this back. We're going to use a shallow 12mm socket, a swivel, and probably a 6-inch extension for our 3/8, and we're going to use our impact driver, loosen and remove that nut. We can now go ahead and remove that wire off the starter there. Now the starter has a wire, single wire that comes down around the side on the back side of the transmission here, and here's a connector. You're gonna press in on this little spring clip right here or tab. You're gonna pinch it and pull that out like so. Now the rest of the wire is actually attached to the starter. So when we unbolt the starter, this wire is going to come out with it. Underneath here, we have two 14mm bolts, one here, and then one diagonal up right here. We're gonna use our deep socket and our ratchet. Let's go ahead and break these free. Now the upper bolt, I got it broken free. I can spin that out by hand. Go ahead and pull that bolt out. Pull the bolt out of the bracket. Now on the front side of our cradle, we have our engine oil pan. We're going to use a block of wood and we're going to put it over on the side of the pan, not in the middle of it. And we're going to gently raise that engine up. This is going to allow us a little bit of clearance to go ahead and pull that starter out. Let's go ahead and work that starter up and out. We have to pull the snout out of the transmission area. Let's grab that starter. Let's see if we can bring that up and over the steering rack. You're just moving that steering shaft up and out of the way, and wiggle that starter down and out, and slide that out through the bottom. Let's go ahead and feed our starter up. We need to move that steering shaft out of the way, feed this up and over. Once we get the starter far enough forward, we can go ahead and put the snout into the bell housing. Now, if we pull our harness back here, you can see on the starter there's a little metal dowel that actually helps line up the starter into the transmission bell housing, and the same thing on the top. So you just need to reach up there, grab that starter, kind of get that into position where those dowels line up. All right, we got our lower bolt started. That'll hold the starter up in place. Let's go ahead and grab our other bolt. And we just have to rotate this or clock it into position. Now that we have both bolts started, I'm going to go ahead and snug this down. And as you tighten this, it'll suck that starter right into place. Sometimes you can reach up there and run that bolt in further by hand before you get a ratchet on there. You do want to make sure that starter is going in flush, and that sleeve should be guiding that in. So let's go ahead and tighten up our lower bolt, and we're going to evenly tighten this. There we go. Just rotating back and forth between the two, making sure that that starter goes in nice and flush. Let's go ahead and locate that wire on the starter, which is right here. Go ahead and line this up and install it into our harness right here. Push it in, you can feel it and hear it click into place. And just pull that wire down and over to the side there. Now we can lower our engine down back onto that motor mount. And remove that. Once you have your two bolts installed and tightened down, let's go ahead and torque them to 48 foot-pounds. Go ahead and grab your wire here for the starter solenoid. Get that mounted onto that stud. Install the lock washer, followed by the nut. I'll thread that down as far as I can by hand. And we're going to use our 13mm socket on a swivel. And we want to torque this down to 8.2 foot-pounds. There it is. Once you get that torqued, go ahead and pull that rubber boot over. Now before we install our steering shaft, I'm going to use a bristle brush and just kind of clean some of the splines on this here. Hopefully make it a little bit easier for that steering shaft to slide down onto. I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize compound on the splines here. And we want to grab that steering shaft and we're going to go ahead and line that up, line up our yellow marks on this and start to work this down. Now please keep in mind that even though if you anchor that steering wheel up top, that you might be off a spline or two on the steering rack itself. This would just mean that your steering wheel would not be centered up top. It would be simply corrected by getting alignment performed on the vehicle after you're done with the job. And I'm just going to use a hammer to go ahead and tap this down. Put some anti-seize compound on that. We're going to feed this through. And let's go ahead and tighten that down. And using our 12mm, let's go ahead and snug that down. Now, if you can't get that bolt started, it might just mean that the U-joint collar is not far enough down because this bolt has to slip through the notch on the steering shaft. So you might have to tap that down a little bit further. But once that bolt goes in, it should go in pretty easy. Let's go go ahead and torque down this bolt to 20 foot-pounds. We're going to put some anti-seize compound on these studs right here. Now we install our bracket here. You want to make sure that you have the bushing on both sides. Put that together. Get our 2 transmission bolts in first. Then we're going to line up our bracket here. Go ahead and get those nuts started. Okay, using our 14mm socket, we go ahead and tighten everything down. And we're going to take the nut for our motor mount, and we're going to go right through the wheel well here, up in front of the mount. You can actually get your hand up in there, and we're going to get that nut started, a few threads. Try and thread that down as far as you can. Make sure it's on there pretty good. Now we're going to go up top, and we're going to put our socket and extension on there and tighten that down. Let's feed our socket down inside. And let's go ahead and tighten that down. We're going to install our airbox now. On the bottom, we have our 2 plastic posts here that fit into rubber grommets down inside the frame rail. And we have this port here that actually mates up with a plastic tube down below. So these 3 pieces, make sure they line up as we install this. Also, while we're lining that up, you need to get the air intake tube lined up. Pop that into place. Push that down. We can install our 10mm bolt on the side right here. Yeah, we'll snug that down. And grab your sensor harness right here. Line that up and push that on. You're going to feel in here it snap into place. Install the little retainer clip into the airbox. And let's tighten down our clamp here for the intake tube. Now once that snugs down, you want to give it just a little bit more. You don't want to over tighten it as you can strip the hose clamp. So just make sure that it's good and snug, eliminating any air leaks between the plastic and the rubber intake tube. Install the negative terminal. Snug down the nut here. You do want to make sure that the nut is good and snug. Don't over tighten this because you can crack the clamp. Give that a good wiggle, make sure it doesn't spin on the post. Grab the cover, install the 3 tabs on the back side of the tray first. Press down the front, snapping the cover into position. Go ahead and install your wheel. I'm going to go ahead and get all of our lug nuts started by hand. Once we get all of these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them down. We have our locking key. Go ahead and torque down your lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to use our locking key first. Then we'll continue with the rest in a crisscross pattern. Once you have everything assembled, go ahead and remove your securing strap from the steering wheel. Now remember, you may be off a spline or 2 on the assembly, so you might want to consider going for a road test and then having alignment performed after you're done with the job.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.